Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the first in a new series from the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, and it's called Just About. That title reflects our interest in exploring questions of justice and fairness that arise either for particular populations or in relation to particular issues. The format is experimental and informal and probably a little bit messy. It's a little hybrid between a podcast and a webinar, if you like. So basically, we record a short conversation between people with different kinds of expertise on a given topic. And then a little later, we release that recording via a live stream within a webinar event so that we can take the dialogue further and engage more people. So today's first inaugural episode concerns the experiences of Gypsy, Traveller and Roma people in relation to criminal justice. And we have three excellent panellists with me now: Chelsea McDonagh, Coretta Phillips and Colin Clark. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about those three and then we'll plough in. So having received a first-class undergraduate degree in physical and sports education from St Mary's University, Twickenham, Chelsea completed her MA in education with distinction at King's College London in 2020. She is an Irish traveller, researcher and co-creator of Rombelong, I hope I've said that right, Chelsea, a widening participation programme for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller young people. She's also one of the Civic Futures Fellows working on the London Recovery Board's missions. Coretta's research interests lie in the fields of race, ethnicity, crime, criminal justice and social policy. Her most recent and award-winning book was entitled The Multicultural Prison. That was published by Oxford University Press back in 2012. She has acted as a consultant for organisations such as the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, the UK Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the Judicial Studies Board, CLINCS, the Howard League for Penal Reform and the Metropolitan Black Police Association. And finally, Colin teaches sociology at the University of the West of Scotland, where he works as a professor of sociology and social policy. He is the co-author with Professor Margaret Greenfields of Here to Stay, The Gypsies and Travellers of Britain, and is co-editor with Professor Elena Marushiakova of the journal Romany Studies. Should have practiced that pronunciation beforehand. I hope that was okay. Outside of UWS, Colin's a director of the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights and a trustee of Romano Lav, Roma Voice, that is. Again, apologies for my no doubt mispronunciation. Colin also acts as a research advisor to the Traveller Movement, the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Advisory Council for the Education of Romanis and Other Travellers. So, with all the introductions out of the way, we can plough into the conversation. And we're going to start with Chelsea. So Chelsea, we know that in broad terms, people from ethnic minorities, people who suffer racism in all its forms, very often have negative experiences of the criminal justice system. And I wanted to start by asking you in what ways and to what extent that sort of problem or experience manifests for travellers, Gypsies and Roma people in your experience.
It happens well before you come into contact with the criminal justice system for reasons of your own accord. It happens from childhood. So if I think, I'm 25, I've never had like an interaction, so I've never been arrested, etc. But all of my experiences with the police have been negative. Despite kind of having no reason for them to be. But there's a real marked difference in how I experience policing in my day-to-day work when I am not identifiable as a traveller, and in my kind of personal experiences on the site when I am identified. And it's marked for most people. So for me, I see the kind of that very clearly, because if I use an English accent and pronounce my words in a certain way, I will be spoken to in a certain way and you will be approached in a much gentler way. But actually, most Gypsy Roma Traveller people experience policing in a much more violent way. So even if you're calling the police as a victim, you will have a disproportionate number of police turn up to like a domestic incident, which doesn't then give confidence to the person who has called them. You're still then on the back foot. And I think if you have repeated negative experiences over the course of your life, by the time you get to adulthood, you know, I would never call the police. To protect who? It's not me. You know, I know if I come into contact with the police, I'm probably more likely to be arrested. So will I ring them? No. Would I encourage people to ring them? No. And I think this is kind of where you have, it's probably why a lot of travellers in particular, Irish travellers in particular, will deal with things as families and within communities, because actually there are instances where the police have got involved and it is prolonged issues. It's actually exacerbated issues and meant that they've gone on for years. When actually, if people had been allowed to deal with it how they would usually, the issue would come and go. And I think, you know, that kind of, those marked experiences affect how you, so even, you know, I've been approached by the PPO who, you know, seemingly keeps trying to recruit me, and it's like, no, definitely not. Because for me, it's still, it's way too close.
So, but you're marked out as different by virtue of, well, actually, partly by virtue of being situated in a particular way, in a particular place, and then when police are involved on that site or on those sites, the nature of policing changes, and seems to reflect a greater degree of, I don't know how you would describe it, suspicion or animosity or even fear. What do you think?
I think there's kind of a mixture. You straight away get that kind of standoffish feeling, that kind of we're opposed, and I think it's often how they approach you.
Yeah.
And I do acknowledge that some police forces are better than others.
Mm-hmm.
And some police officers are better than others in terms of, you know, they might approach you a little bit more in a kind of human manner, but actually, generally, across the board, actually, what you get is very, you know, for stuff like a few years ago, they sent in, you know, like 100 riot police to repossess an empty plot. No one was in it. That's where they've come to do it. But that's disproportionate to, and even though it had nothing to do with anyone else, we were treated like the way the police reacted with us was very, very aggressive. They're trying to intimidate you, but actually, you know, I've been in these situations enough that I'm not going to be intimidated. And if they don't like when you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, actually, no, you can't do that. That almost then seems to kind of, they get a little bit annoyed, but actually, for me as a system, it's like you're always going to have that experience. You're always going to kind of, so for me, I know some people go, actually, you know, if we have more Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people joining the police, it's going to get better. But actually, that's not being the case for the minority groups. And I don't believe that as a line, kind of, people saying, you know, that'll improve. No, it won't. You can't. For me as an individual, my personal opinion is all you're doing is like putting yourself through trauma.
Sorry to interrupt, but thinking beyond policing, you know, at later or subsequent stages in relation to criminal justice, either with courts or in prisons or in probation, and obviously those may be things that you can't speak to from personal experience, but from your wider understanding and from your own kind of research and activism, if you like, what do you understand to be the issues as people move through the criminal justice system?
And we know there are massive issues because you have massive kind of representation at each stages, and often I think what we see is kind of more heavy sentences. So if you're looking at kind of what the sentences people are getting and for the crimes they're committing, you're kind of getting those heavier sentences, but also kind of, you know, less likely to get tagged or to kind of get community orders, and more likely to kind of go for custodial sentences. You know, they're travellers, so they must be a risk.
Mm.
You know, I know someone who's deemed a risk, so they haven't been allowed bail, despite the fact that they've lived in one place their whole life. But actually, their connection on one side of the family, and the judge says, you know, yeah, as travellers, that person's a flight risk. And that's not uncommon, and I think it's why many people, you know, would try not to be identifiable as a traveller when they go to court.
Yeah.
And you have those conversations where you say, don't wear that, did you change your accent, you know, make sure you try and do that, because the moment you're identified, you know that it's going to change how you're experiencing that system.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. We'll hopefully come back and pick up on some of those points as the conversation unfolds, but I'm going to move on to Coretta now. Coretta, obviously you've been doing work in relation to racism and the experience of ethnic minorities in relation to criminal justice for a long time, but more recently you've secured a large grant from the Economic and Social Research Council to essentially, I think, to plug a big gap in the evidence base in this area. So can you tell us a bit about how and why you became aware of that gap and what its dimensions are and what you hope to do to address it in the study?
Yeah, so I wanted to just sort of pick up on what Chelsea was saying, because criminologists like myself have focused much more on the larger minority ethnic groups in England and Wales, so particularly those of Black and Asian origin. But in everything that Chelsea said, I think there are echoes in the experiences of those other minority ethnic groups. And I think what Chelsea was talking about is the kind of the sort of criminological notion that minority groups can be over-policed and under-protected. And very much at the heart of that, when she was talking about the experiences of policing, of heightened suspicion, of aggression, of fear, that at the heart of that is a really simple kind of racist impulse. I mean, that's about positioning, in this case, gypsies and travellers as inferior, as as criminally inclined. And I think because, as you said in the introduction, although I see myself as a criminologist, I also have a history, a kind of educational history in social policy. So for me, when we're thinking about victimisation, looking at ordinary crimes or looking at racist violence and hate crimes, and also when we're looking at offending, that for me, we also need to think about the kinds of probabilities and possibilities of discrimination long before the criminal justice system. And again, Chelsea was, began by sort of mentioning that it happens long before perhaps contact with the criminal justice system. It happens in the education system in relation to housing, and also in relation to employment. And I think, given what we know as criminologists, and we know that will increase the pressures to offend, but will also make people really vulnerable to victimisation. And so for me, somewhat surprisingly, we don't have information, we don't even have estimates on the likelihood of gypsies and travellers, their risks in terms of being victims of crime. So we know about the larger minority ethnic groups, but we don't know about gypsies and travellers and those of Roma origin, and we don't know that because we get most of our information from the crime survey. That's a household-based survey. It doesn't oversample gypsies and travellers who are in housing, so there are tiny, tiny numbers. And obviously it doesn't also incorporate those who are mobile, those who are very likely, for the reasons Chelsea mentioned, to be really suspicious of authorities. So to me, it seems deeply problematic that we don't know about the risks of crime for this vulnerable group, who are in lots of policy areas discriminated against. And I just wanted to spell this out in a bit more detail, because some research that was done for the Equalities and Human Rights Commission did a survey of a variety of different groups that are protected by the equalities legislation. And they produce a figure which is, you know, the degree to which people that were answering the survey felt negative towards different kinds of groups. So it was looking at sexual minorities, it was looking at men and women, and et cetera, et cetera. It's looking at lots of different racial and ethnic groups. And I just wanted to sort of, just to give you an idea of what seems to be a really deep-seated and, you know, pretty widespread hatred of gypsies and travellers. So this research found that it was only Gypsy, Roma and Travellers who were frequently viewed more negatively. So the survey found that overall 5% were entirely negative towards Black people, 22% felt entirely negative towards Muslims, 27% towards immigrants, but 44% of those people that answered the survey felt entirely negatively towards gypsies and travellers. So, you know, that level of distrust, hatred is likely to impact, and we know, of course, and Chelsea and Colin will know this research much better than me, that these groups are therefore really vulnerable in all of the kinds of areas. And then there is also the impact of criminal justice. So our research was really from the starting point that the narrative about gypsies and travellers focuses mostly on them as potential offenders, but we don't know about their risks of victimisation. And so that was the kind of the sort of starting point for the study, that this is a group that for whom we don't have estimates of victimisation. So that was the kind of, you know, that was the impetus for this research study, and to be able to also understand a bit more about experiences of injustice across the criminal justice process. And the things that Chelsea mentioned are very much echoed in the studies which have looked at Black and Asian groups. And so our research is about trying to understand more about those experiences of victimisation and also experiences of violence by the criminal justice system that's underpinned by a really deep-seated racism against these groups.
Yeah, great, Greta, thanks for that. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to move straight on to Colin, and then hopefully we can all come back into the conversation at the end. Colin, in this area, as in everything else, perhaps Scotland's a little bit different, but how and to what extent do the same issues that Chelsea and Coretta have discussed play out in the Scottish context, as you understand it? And also, what do we need to do here in terms of research and activism to address these questions?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the issues that both Chelsea and Coretta mentioned there will be, you know, very noticeable and very identifiable with the different families and communities, you know, here in Scotland. And I was really struck by what Chelsea was saying, because I mean, obviously, those lived experiences, you know, quite recently came into the national headlines because of the Ponton scandal, and kind of just really demonstrated some of what Chelsea was saying about, even by your surname, you could be targeted and subjected to discriminatory and exclusionary, you know, service provision by, you know, an organisation such as Ponton. So it does begin, you know, from birth in that sort of sense. In Scotland, I mean, one of the issues it seems to me in Scotland that is important to grasp is around land use. And for many families who are nomadic or partially nomadic during different parts of the year, their main interaction with the police will come through stopping on roadside encampments. And even now in 2021, the police will routinely use the 1865 Trespass Act, which was amended in 1982 by the Criminal Justice Act, but the trespass of, you know, nomadism in Scotland goes back to 1865. And that's really, I suppose, and there was a Land Reform Act in 2003, which ostensibly gave a right to roam, but a right to roam to only certain people in certain circumstances and on certain parts of land. And I think the norms around fines, penalties, but the legislative and practice dimensions are kind of different. And in Scotland, for many years, for about 20 years, 2 decades really, there was a toleration policy in operation. This was before devolution kind of kicked in. And there was a Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on Scotland's travelling people. It ran from the late 1970s up to about 1999, 2000, it wound up, really when devolution kind of kicked in. And that kind of body really oversaw the so-called toleration of Scotland's travel. And you can imagine, you know, how it must be and how it must have felt for those families to be told that they would be tolerated in a particular area, in a particular kind of set of circumstances. After devolution, things did change a little bit. There was a lot of reports and a lot of money spent on those reports, but not an awful lot of money following through into, for example, upgrading sites and trying to challenge some of the stereotypes that followed through into the kind of criminal justice sort of system. But there have been some shifts. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the Scottish Government promised a £20 million investment in sites and pitches up here in Scotland. And that's on the back of some financial relief due to the impact of COVID-19 on the families and on the communities. But yeah, I mean, the discrimination and the anecdotal evidence that of police and other authorities, and because this isn't just a police issue, I think that's the other side of it here. The targeting of families, the targeting of communities, stop and search, particularly of vans by the police, also evictions, constant kind of evictions. It doesn't happen everywhere in Scotland. I mean, I don't want to name and shame, but the borders of Scotland and Aberdeenshire do not fare particularly well here, particularly if you look to local press reports, radio call-in shows, and you can hear the prejudice live on air and from journalists who really should know a lot better. And the families will talk about going into GP surgeries, going into health boards, going into social security offices, going into schools and receiving unfavourable treatment and what they perceive as discriminatory treatment. And again, that can be determined, as Chelsea was saying, by your surname, by what your postcode is, about your type of accommodation, your type of employment, and so on. So in other words, I suppose, even though one of my concerns is about land use and the criminalisation of nomadism, which is now happening across the UK, but it's long existed in Scotland, fixing issues of accommodation are not going to stop racist incidents in other areas of Scottish social policy with regards to Gypsy travellers and Roma communities in Scotland. And again, I think COVID-19 and also Brexit, actually, for Roma communities from Central and Eastern Europe here in Scotland, Brexit and COVID have kind of shone a bit of a spotlight on that. And I think in particular, there is a need to show the Scottish Government to show a commitment to the right to commercial nomadism and for the families that live and work on that basis. And I'm hoping very much that the £20 million grant and that gets spent quickly and the work begins shortly. It doesn't just happen on permanent sites and permanent pitches, but also on transit sites and accommodation as well. But that's where I'll leave it for now.
Great, thanks, Colin. Thanks, everybody. So let me just try and summarise a little bit, and then I'll ask just one question for anybody to kind of come back to me on before we kind of close off on this pre-recorded part of the dialogue and then move into the webinar part. So I'm here as the ignorant person who's learning from you all in terms of your expertise in relation to this topic. And here's what I think I'm hearing. And please just do correct me if I get this wrong. So we've got a problem which seems rooted in ignorance and fear of a number of populations who are identified in a certain way, perhaps who identify in a certain way, and who live in a certain way which is unfamiliar or uncommon or unusual in the context of mainstream society, if that's a way to put it. And the fear and ignorance then comes to be reflected in interactions with criminal justice in a number of ways. One is modalities of policing and wider social control, which are experienced by those communities as hostile, essentially, and as founded on suspicion and distrust. And then as that familiar problem of being under-policed as a victim and over-policed as a potential offender plays out, we see people processed through the criminal justice system either hiding their identity or suffering the consequences of its exposure, which is more severe criminalization and more severe penalization. A kind of double jeopardy, if you like, or multiple jeopardy that is associated with the unfair reaction to and processing of difference. So first of all, does that sound like a reasonable summary? And secondly, what then, I know that we need to do the research, and I know that Coretta's only at the beginning of doing her study, but beyond the obvious answer that we need to do more research and understand these issues better, what's the way to begin to unpick the problem and produce responses which are more constructive and which go beyond a kind of grudging toleration into something which might look a bit more like a celebration of difference and diversity? So first of all, is my summary accurate? And secondly, how do we respond? I don't know who wants to come back on that.
I think for me, it's worth pointing out that even travellers who adhere to the norm and who might live in housing, in traditional houses, whatever, they still experience disproportionate policing, even when really they're not very much different to anyone else. So I think it's worth kind of making sure that because it goes beyond kind of for me some of it comes back to who are the police and what are the police for. And in my opinion, it isn't to protect. It was never to protect travellers. To police them, yes. To protect the interests of the state, yes, and property. But for me, and I don't think it ever will be. And I think, yes, there can be positive drives to increase representation, etc. But actually, for me, that police, that whole system, if we look at it, for me, it is inherently violent, and I don't necessarily think it is improved by increased representation. It hasn't been for other minority groups, and I don't think that will improve for us. And I don't know, for me, it's kind of, is it a cop-out to go, oh, we're just kind of fearful because they're different, because instead of actually going, just say you hate travellers and go, and actually calling out some of the behaviour for what it is. And Colin pointed out the Pontins case. We know that's inherent in the criminal justice system and in every other system. I got 3 out of 4 grandparents' names. I nearly had a full house. But this was not a surprise to any of us. We were like, oh yeah, and the same thing happens in policing. Yeah. And I think the problem is you're never really gonna, I don't know how much of that we're going to get to the bottom of, and to really know the full extent of kind of the impact and how that affects, in terms of the sentences that are given. because often it's not tracked. And I will hear comments and go, they can't say that, but they did. You know, police officers go in, you're giving them their address and them going, oh, that's a traveller site, let's put traveller site by the address, despite the fact that that address has never said traveller site.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know, like, it's, for me, I don't know if reform is the way forward.
Understood. So increasing understanding isn't going to be the answer if the system is built on the idea that the police and the criminal justice system exists to manage inequality and also to kind of suppress or repress non-conformity, if that's the right expression. I'm not sure. Any thoughts from Coretta or Colin to wind up this part of the conversation?
So, I mean, I think I would agree with Chelsea, and also maybe challenge the idea that it's about ignorance, because I think that one of the things that is really shocking in relation to gypsies and travellers and Roma more generally is the kind of acceptability of racism that can be shown towards them. And this is interesting to me as somebody from a minority ethnic group, but also somebody who's spent all my career looking at racism and ethnic inequalities, to think about the way in which travellers and gypsies and Roma are kind of positioned politically. And, you know, the irony, I mean, Chelsea and Colin will have lots of examples from their knowledge, both personal and professional, that I don't have. But, you know, it struck me that at the time when the country was beginning to think about the possibilities of institutional racism, which, as we know from the last week or so, it's now arguing is no longer an issue in British society, somewhat bizarrely. You know, at the time that Jack Straw was welcoming the Lawrence inquiry and was very critical of the police, he was also suggesting that travellers were criminally inclined and, you know, weren't real gypsies. And so I think that some of that, and I keep using this word because I think it's accurate, but also it's not used sufficiently to explain the experience, is that is just straightforward racism. There are multiple forms. It can operate in direct and indirect ways. It can operate in different kinds of settings. But actually, it still seems to be acceptable amongst politicians to use words to describe gypsies and travellers that wouldn't be no longer acceptable for Black and Asian groups. And I think that the simplicity of that actually is what is the problem. Is that, you know, that acceptability of racism towards this group is you know, so fundamental to their experiences subsequently.
Right, that sounds like the perfect moment to press pause and wait for the wider conversation. So I think at that point I'll just say thank you to the panelists. I'll stop the recording, and in due course we'll take it out to the wider conversation in the webinar. But thanks very much for now, anyway, for your contributions already.